On behalf of the University Honors College at Middle Tennessee State University, I'm honored to welcome all of you here today. My name is Dr. Philip Phillips, and I'm the Associate Dean. I'd like to recognize our own Dean, Dr. John Bile, who is in attendance. This is the last meeting of our lecture series for the semester, and I'm very pleased to introduce three speakers. We have Matthew Fuller, Trevor Moyo, and Will Wright, all of whom recently successfully defended their honors theses. Each of them was selected to give a presentation today. They come from different disciplines, and I think it's a great opportunity for us to get a sense of what our peers have done. Those of you who are honor students and who are on track to graduate with University Honors, this is a good opportunity to learn from your classmates about what worked well for them, what the experience was like, and to be able to ask some questions along those lines. So I want to introduce each person individually. We're allocating 10 minutes per speaker to give a presentation, and we will reserve a little bit of time at the very end for questions, and then we'll shift over to our reflective essay. Our first speaker is Matthew Fuller, who is an MTSU Presidential Scholar majoring in biology. He has a Eureka research grant and is working with the Tennessee Center for Botanical Medicine Research as part of their ginseng initiative. Matthew's thesis, written under the direction of Dr. Elliot Charles Altman, is entitled Initiation and Optimization of American Ginseng Panax quinquefolius L. Callus and Suspension Cultures for Use in Plant Regeneration Techniques and Root Cultures. Please join me in welcoming Matthew.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Dr. Phillips said, my name is Matt Fuller, and this really long, cumbersome title is my thesis. Let's see. The plant I'm working with is known as Panax quinquefolius. It is American ginseng. It is a medicinal herb in the Aureliaceae, the ivy family. It looks kind of like this. There's a recent television show about it called Appalachian Outlaws, where people actually pick this stuff from the wild. And the reason that they pick this stuff from the wild is it is very valuable. This crop demands a price anywhere from $400 to $1,000 a pound dry weight. It is a very expensive medicinal drug. The only problem with growing this plant is incredibly hard to cultivate. There is an 8-year waiting time between putting it in the ground and reaping the profits before you can actually do anything with this plant. And not only that, it takes a year for the seed to stratify. To add to that problem, poaching is a serious problem with this plant, because it's much easier to go in the wild and just yank up a plant from the wild than it is to actually take those 8 years to actually grow it. So you have problems from the cultivation standpoint and from poaching standpoint. So what could probably be a solution to this that doesn't harm wild reserves? And that's really the big question that I approached this thesis with. How would one attain a large amount of this tissue of this plant without harming wild populations? And we can find an answer to that problem through plant tissue culture work. For those of you who aren't aware, plant tissue culture work involves the culturing or growing of plant cells and tissues outside of the organism. Plants can do this because their cells are adaptable and they're totipotent. That means that every single cell in a plant is capable of regenerating into an entire plant. Plant tissue culture work has applications in all sorts of fields, ranging from plant biotech, naturally, to metabolic processes, studying such processes. And it also has applications in landscaping and horticulture and environmental science. The work that I do with is called callus culture. This involves inducing a type of tissue that is undifferentiated. It's sort of like a plant tumor, almost. And if you've ever been in, seen a tree with a limb chopped off, and you see those weird kind of growths that cover the wound site, that's actually a callus in nature. That's because plants actually are capable of producing this tissue type on their own. Now these pictures that you see, these are actually cultures that we've done in the lab, that we've isolated and that we've grown up from a single seed. This is what they kind of look like. This kind of callus is probably the best callus that we want to look for. It is friable, which means it breaks apart kind of easily, and it's white and cream color in coloration. So we work with callus. Well, what is callus good for? Callus is what we know as, it divides indefinitely. It will continue to divide and divide and divide as long as you give it the proper nutrients and culture conditions. Not only that, you can form plant embryos from this. And if you combine that with the fact that it continues to divide and divide, you have an infinite source of embryos. And lastly, you can form direct callus to root or callus to stem organogenic processes. And this is useful if you just want to form a root culture of something, like something that produces valuable compounds in its roots, like ginseng. So the purpose of this thesis is to detail the development of a fast-growing callus and suspension culture in order to develop these compounds. These cultures then can be used in larger applications for if somebody wants to come up and do research on ginseng, if they want to do large-scale production of these compounds, they can turn to this work and they say, that's how we do it. So the big whole picture is we want to take this plant and form this tissue type with it. In order to do that, we set up a methodology. And while this is one page, this took a year. This plant was ridiculously hard to work with, which really explains why there's not a lot of research done on this plant. So the first thing that we wanted to do was we wanted to surface sterilize some seeds and get them into germination media. This took a very long time because seeds of Panax cincifolius American ginseng don't like to germinate. They are very notoriously difficult to work with. But we finally got a couple of seeds to actually germinate, as shown in that picture over there. What happened next was really something quite magical. In the medium, we added hormones that the plant produces anyways in order to try to elicit a callus response. And so what happened is they germinated, and straight after germinating, they formed direct callus. It's almost magical. And so we took that callus and we played it onto plates that contained growth medium. And they kind of looked like that at first. They weren't very impressive. But over time and over generations, we were able to amplify it into its present state. Light, fluffy, really big callus. And so as a process of amplifying the callus, we had to find different ways of culturing it that required new media supplements. In order to do that, we evaluated things like coconut water and niacin. If you've been in a supermarket and you've seen coconut water or coconut milk, it's kind of the same thing, except it's for laboratory grade. And what we found was that there was actually a significant difference. If you added coconut water, it will actually increase the rate of growth of the tissues. But since we couldn't stop there, plates only provide about so much room for growth. So we wanted to step this up to a larger scale. We put this in suspension. So in order to do that, we had to test two different methods of putting it in suspension. We used a modified bioreactor setting, which involved the passing of air through water and into the culture. It kind of like oxygenate the tissues, and we kind of just used a shaker culture. And this is really where the cool stuff of the project came through. Whenever we tested the bioreactor system actually dried out very fast. It wasn't very promising results because we had a lot of drying stress. But in the shaker, you see this really white, almost cream of chicken soup-like suspension. All of this is cells. It is just a broth of cells. And from a standpoint of a plant that doesn't like to be cultured, that's a really big achievement. You have a plant that doesn't like to be cultured like this, and you have a whole suspension of these cells. And whenever we filtered it out, it looked like that over there. You see, it's still got that white, creamy-looking callus texture to it. And once we got that, we wanted to step this up to root production. Because the tap roots are the most valuable product of ginseng, we wanted to move to see if we could induce roots. And we did. We were able to take callus and plate it onto root-inducing media. And root-inducing media contains hormones that the plant produces that direct the formation of roots. And after that, these calli started producing roots. Unfortunately, they don't like to do that. And so what happens is they produce these chemicals that kind of inhibit their own growth. It's phenolics. They poison the environment that it's living in. The plant uses this as kind of like a defensive measure. If it's ever wounded in the wild, it'll produce phenolic compounds, which will cause a die-off reaction in the plant. That's a bad thing. So we developed, we added activated charcoal that would suck up the phenolic compounds. So in conclusion, we were able to successfully take a callus tissue from a recalcitrant, unable to work with plant species, and not only did we get a healthy dividing callus culture, we were able to obtain a suspension culture, we were able to obtain roots, we were able to obtain a large stock of tissues. Or, in other words, we were able to start with this little seed and a whole incubator full of plates. So where can we probably take this kind of stuff? I mean, what does it matter that we were able to isolate callus from ginseng? Well, with tissue production lines of this plant, you can create a system where you produce this tissue. Because the callus actually does produce the chemicals that ginseng is known for, you can simply just grow these cells. And since the cells contain the chemical, you can harvest these cells on a massive scale to potentially produce a product. Alternatively, you can go this route. For people in genetics work, hairy root transformation involves the inoculation of a bacterium that does some weird things and actually causes this disease that causes roots to basically go haywire and produce roots everywhere. This is really important for upregulating the production of these compounds if you really wanted to maximize the production of these compounds. And lastly, something that I'm very interested in is the production of clones of this plant. Like I said earlier, these calli are capable of regenerating into an entire plant. That's really important because in the wild, these plants are being poached like year after year, damaging wild populations. Through a system like this, where we can clonally propagate this plant, hopefully one day we can perhaps provide clones to replace damaged wild populations. All right.
Our second speaker is Trevor Moyo, who is an honors transfer fellow majoring in land development and residential building management. He's the president of the MTSU Circle of the Omicron Delta Kappa Leadership Honor Society, housed here in the Honors College. Trevor's thesis, written under the direction of Dr. Frank Minchello, is investigating the role of residential housing in enhancing economic development in sub-Saharan African nations. Please join me in welcoming Trevor.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to really thank you all for being here today. And I'm really honored to have this opportunity to talk to you a little bit about my honors thesis writing experience and maybe tell you a little bit about my project. Well, I've been told that I speak with an accent and that it can be very distracting with people trying to figure out where is it from, place it and all. So I decided that I'll get that right out of the way, right out of the bat. I am from right there, a little place called Bulawayo in Zimbabwe. And I actually went through the trouble of showing a Google image of where I grew up. That is my home right there, number 3 Project Lane in Newton West, in Bulawayo. So I can see that some of you are asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with his thesis project? Well, I'd like to call your attention to this little lot here on the corner. That was where, when I was growing up, it was like there was nothing there. It was overgrown, and my friends and I would disappear in there for hours, We actually considered it our lot. Yeah, it was our place. Well, in 1992, someone had the audacity to purchase that place and started building their home on there. And this is a Google image that you see from 2004. Now, this lot was purchased in 1992. So in 2004, where you see that image, it took them 12 years before they put in a fence and built the temporary structure where they were living. In 2005, you see that image right there, they started the foundation. That was 13 years. In 2009, those are the walls. 2009, that's 17 years later, they started building the walls. And then the house is finally completed in 2010. Took just 18 years. Now, I wish I could tell you that this was unique, but unfortunately, this is just the way it's done in sub-Saharan Africa. Am I right, Dr. Michelo? Yes. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Michelo, my advisor. This wouldn't have been possible without him. So, thank you. So, anyways, you know, it's incredible that it should have taken this long, but this is just the way it's done in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's what they call incremental building. And as you can see, it can take forever to do. So can you imagine my surprise when I started building houses in the United States, and we could knock out a 3,000 square foot house in under 6 months. I mean, people could actually make a living building houses. You know, imagine trying to make a living building a house in sub-Saharan Africa. You'd start, work 3 days, and then your client would come back and say, oh, well, we've run out of materials. You know, come back in 2 or 3 years and do another 3 days worth of work. Say, this is absolutely impossible. You know, you just couldn't do it. So, you know, I finally realized that, you know, that there is a connection between economies and housing. And it actually really hit home in 2007 when the housing industry in the United States went down and actually took the entire global economy with it. That's when I realized that, oh, you know what? You've got housing on one hand and economies on the other, and the two are absolutely connected. There's a real link between the two. So let's fast forward to 2013 when I was at Nashville State Community College, and I found out that the honors college at MTSU would actually give you scholarship money if you would commit, amongst other things, to writing an honors thesis and so on and so forth. Well, I'll tell you, by the time everything after money was said, I was on that bus saying, thesis what now? Yeah. You know? And so I came down here, and when the dust settled, I came to see Laura Clifford and asked her, so well, what have I just committed to? What is this thesis thing? And Laura told me that, well, you know, you write a research paper. It could be about anything. I said, what? And she said, well, it's something that you are passionate about, something that you're curious about. And I mean, I just, you know, couldn't even comprehend what she was talking about. She took me down to the library and showed me what a thesis looked like when it was finished. And I remember thinking to myself, woman, you do realize that you're showing me a book here, right? I mean, what could I possibly have to say that could be put into a book? So at that point, I was thinking to myself, well, I've got the money on the one hand, but this book on the other, and I mean, and that's when it hit me, that something that I'm curious about, something that that I'm passionate about. Well, oh, you all are too kind, honestly. So in any case, my thesis basically is based on the proposition that people are the most valuable resource of any economy. Not the resources, not natural resources, it's people that count. When you get your people to be productive, then, you know, things will go well for you. Unfortunately, in the common understanding of world economics, people believe that, you know, the way to economic growth is that you exploit comparative and and competitive advantages and engage with the global community in open competition, and that's how you get economic growth. In other words, they're talking about you focus on things, right? And actually, when I started this thesis, I believe this as well. In fact, here's something that I wrote in an initial draft. We live in a global environment in which specialization and the exchange of goods and services based on competitive and comparative advantages is the cost of participation. Through the free flow of information, knowledge, and ideas, many ideas and aspirations have been spread across the globe with an evenness which is unprecedented throughout human history. Ingenuity has followed wherever commerce could be derived from these desires and aspirations to create a network through which the resulting demand could be met with a steady supply of goods and services. If humanity is a social species, then this network of exchange has become the dominant mechanism by which its interactions are conducted in the 21st century. And the key to that participation is the ability to compete, the ability to specialize and have something with which to pay the price of interaction. Unfortunately, I came to realize that there's one simple truth, is that these folks cannot compete with that. I mean, I'm not trying to make anybody, raise any sympathies or be controversial. It's a simple fact that if your economy is operating at this level, you cannot expect to compete and win against that. It's just not going to happen. So, let's think about it. The fact of the matter is that the way economies grow has been known since at least 1956 when Robert Solow wrote his paper on the theory of economic growth. There's just two ways in which an economy can grow. You can have extensive growth, which is when you add machinery, other words, capital or more workers. So you build more roads, you build more machines, you build more buildings. Unfortunately, what happens is that at some point, you have two roads where only one will do. And eventually, the productivity that you get from each new additional item that you put in simply doesn't do as much for you. You get diminishing returns. So this is not the way you want to do it, right? The second way is intensive growth. Now, this is when you add technology. And when economists speak about technology, they're not talking about your cell phone or your computer or any of those things. They're talking about the knowledge of how to produce. That means you have the scientists who figure things out. You get inventors like Bill Gates, entrepreneurs, who make things that convert those inventions into things that society can use. You get engineers who build those things. In other words, you want to focus your attention on people, right? So, at the end of the day, what do you want to do? If you want to focus your attention on people, you have to provide those things that make people function in a society, right? So, you provide what? You provide security, because at the end of the day, as long as people don't feel safe, they're not going to be productive, right? What do you provide? You provide health and wellness. You make sure that people are healthy, because healthy people make healthy communities, and healthy communities are active communities, and in order for a community to thrive, it must be active, right? You provide infrastructure, and I'm not talking about the kind of infrastructure that, that the ports and roads that connect mines and international markets. No, I'm talking about the kind of infrastructure that connects customers with businesses. I'm talking about the kind of infrastructure that takes people to work and back home again. I'm talking about the kind of infrastructure that helps children go to school and learn, right? Because that's where your economic growth will come from. You have to provide education, because at the end of the day, little Susie, who is going to be the inventor of tomorrow, has to have a safe, warm place so she can study and do well in school in the future. Now, the list goes on and on and on, and at the end of the day, I've got 99 problems. But where to start? Well, what about at that point where all these things intersect? Say you could find something that will not necessarily solve every single problem, but at least hit that point where all these things connect, so that when you start to solve that one thing, you could start to solve incrementally and, most importantly, simultaneously all the other problems so that people start to, to become productive, right? And it is simply my contention that housing, while not solving every problem that you have, is going to solve enough of those problems, or at least start to solve every single one of those problems, enough that you actually generate economic development. And so, well, that's basically my thesis. And I guess the last thing that I would like to say is that, it was an incredible experience to write it. I'd be lying to you if I said it was easy. I came very close to giving up. But at the end of the day, submitting that thesis is something awesome. And if you are thinking about writing a thesis, I'll tell you to absolutely do it. I mean, the feeling is kind of like, John Vile, I am Zeus, and this is Athena, my child. And it was absolutely an awesome feeling, and I would absolutely encourage you to, do it, and good luck to everybody. So, thank you.
I'm pleased to introduce our third speaker, Will Wright, who is a Buchanan Fellow majoring in philosophy. He is Chief of Academic Affairs for Phi Mu Alpha Symphonia Fraternity at MTSU. He wrote his thesis under the direction of Dr. Ron Bombardi, and his thesis is titled Offloading Consciousness, Will Cyborgs Have Selves? Please join me in welcoming Will.
All right, thank you guys. So like Dr. Phillips said, my name is Will Wright, and I will be giving you a brief overview of my thesis, what I was trying to do, and hopefully I did a good job at it. Its title is Offloading Consciousness, Will Cyborgs Have Selves? So when I first started thinking about the mind, when I first became interested in who I was and what it meant to be me, it really started, curiously enough, in a philosophy of mind class a few semesters ago. I went into the class with an understanding that I was autonomous, I was causally in charge of who I was and what I was doing, and I had this perception of myself, which, as I began to encounter certain theories, started to undermine this notion. And so I took this thesis as an opportunity to begin to understand what was actually happening here. When you encounter readings and theories in mind, they sort of contradict each other, counteract a lot of the time. So you have to unearth these and unpack these things. And so I took this opportunity, and I would definitely recommend anybody to do this, because getting into a field like this is very, very difficult, but using this as a force to drive you is well worth the time. So how does the brain create the self? How does the brain create this mind, this autobiographical narrative, which I feel? I have a subjective nature. I feel these things happening to me, but why? So we know that the self is generated by neuronal systems, physically formed systems found in the brain. Everything that we are results from these patterns, these networks, these systems, these connections. I believe that the answer to how a self can become an emergent phenomenon from the physical brain will be revealed through artificial replication, artificial intelligence. Technology can serve as the microscope, the tool through which we can use to examine the subjective nature of ourselves, because we are largely subjective to our consciousness. So how can we view it objectively? That was the intent of my thesis. Why is there this subjective feeling self? Why does it emerge from the brain? Why does matter do this? The appearance of self is largely misleading. I had this notion that I was in control, that I was autonomous, that I was the causally arbiter of understanding, that I was just some form in the world that was acting all these things out. However, I began to realize that so many of these things happening in the world pushed me back and forth and influenced who I was. And these things are largely out of my control. Things like the placebo effect, things like bystander effect, the way that split-brain patients can confabulate a narrative for why something is happening to them. A good first experiment that really undermined my notion of self came from a man named Benjamin LeVay, who he demonstrated that Before you have and can register the volition to act, your brain has actually begun firing those electrical signals about half a second before you actually register them consciously. So the trouble here is that we have a history in philosophy and science of an unknowable, immaterial self, of a self that can't be studied scientifically. And so it's important for me to sort of unearth this at first. And there's many ways to rematerialize the mind. One of the principal ways is a man named Phineas Gage. And I've encountered this, I'm sure many of you have encountered this man named Phineas Gage. In many of my psychology classes, every single one has their own tale of what happened to him. Essentially, he was a railroad foreman who in 1848 was laying down some tracks and accidentally tampered in some dynamite. And as he was tampering the dynamite, his tampering stick exploded, shot up through his jaw, up through his brain, severing his left frontal cortex. Now, miraculously, Phineas Gage survived. But only his physical body survived. His mental life changed inalterably. Who he was emotionally and who he was as a person was lost with the result of damage from the brain. So we can see, this is just one case, but it's the most notorious case. We can see through many, many cases that the brain creates the personhood. The brain creates the self. So what are we doing when we say, where is consciousness? When we're trying to find the mind. Well, a man named Gilbert Ryle in 1949 gave credence to the mistake that we were making here. He called it a category error. He said that when we're looking for consciousness, when people like René Descartes in the 1600s was trying to find the mind, and he said, oh, it can't be there. I can't find the mind inside the brain, therefore it must be immaterial. When people did this, they're making a category error. They're looking for an abstract term in the concrete world. So they've taken something that was a group associative term and tried to find it in the material world. Riles likens this to going on a tour of the university, right? You go on a tour of the university, you see the honors college, super nice. You see the stadium, good stuff. You see that blue horseshoe, everyone loves that. You see all these things and you say, oh, I loved it. I loved the tour, but where was the university? I missed the university. The tour guide would say to you, well, the university wasn't an actual thing. It was just the abstract term for all the physical manifestations, all the iterations of the university. The same thing we're doing when we say consciousness. It's just a catch-all term for the physical brain states. So it's important to rematerialize the mind in this way so that science had a chance to really get in there and understand what is going on and how the self can be created. So it's in this sort of notion, this sort of understanding that we can begin to use AI, to use technology, to unearth how the brain is operating. The first guy to really do this came a year after Ryle in 1950, a man named Alan Turing. I think there's a movie actually that came out recently about him, but I haven't seen it, but I heard it was good. But in 1950, he was the first one to postulate a sort of intelligence that was functional and an intelligence that you could see into the world. So it wasn't some Platonic ideal of intelligence. It was actually the capacity to be intelligent, to perform intelligently. So what was nice and revolutionary about his thought experiment was that he drew a line in the sand. He said, if a machine can pass this, then we must give them human-level intelligence. And he called this Turing test the imitation game. Essentially it went something like this. Imagine a man in a room. He's going to ask questions to two different entities. One of the entities is a machine, and one's a man. Now, when he gets the answers back, if he cannot determine which one's the man, which one's the machine, then necessarily the machine must be given human-level intelligence. And so we've been working on this for 60, 70 years since this time. And the culmination of it, in my mind, came in 2011 when a machine named Watson competed on the game show Jeopardy! I don't know if any of you saw this, but if you want to look it up on YouTube sometime, it's really miraculous. The machine Watson beat the two most winning competitors ever in the history of Jeopardy! It beat them both. And the amazing thing about Watson is that it was a machine without connection to the internet, without a system of memory set in place, without a system of concrete memory. Rather, it formed associative patterns, the same way that our neurons have statistical algorithms in order to understand things. We don't have a single neuron in our brain with the knowledge of our grandmother. We don't have a neuron in our brain that can be destroyed. Rather, it's a system of connections that are formed, cortical structures. So Watson beat them handedly. And I really do recommend that you go watch this because it's a fascinating thing. But there's still, when you're talking about AI, there's still a lot of room there to say, okay, they can perform the same way, but will they have a self? Will they have the subjective nature? Will there be something feeling there the same way we are conscious? When you're encountering AI and when you're talking about it, there's one guy you always come across who is warning us against giving understanding to these machines. He's a man named John Searle, who in 1980 postulated a thought experiment to demonstrate what is really going on in a machine and how there is no understanding. He called it the Chinese room thought experiment. So imagine a man in a room who has no understanding of Chinese. He knows English, knows no Chinese, but he has a set of rules written all in English and 2 sets of Chinese characters. The rules allow him to correlate the corresponding Chinese characters on either side. So when someone slides some Chinese characters into the room, he can use his list of English, find the corresponding set of Chinese characters, and slide them out of the room. Now, to an observer to this Chinese room, John Searle wants to say, it may look as if the machine understands Chinese. It responds, surely, but it doesn't really know. There's no true knowledge there. So putting aside for a second that the man does know something. He knows English. He knows how to understand his rules. Putting that aside for a second, what John Searle didn't know is that he actually gave a great explication of how the brain works. Our brain doesn't know English. Its language is electrical signals. It doesn't speak English at all. Rather, what's happening is I'm vibrating my vocal cords, sending wavelengths to your ears. Your pinna focuses it in to the eardrum, vibrating it, causing electrical signals to fire in your brain. And then hopefully they fire in a way where you understand. And you say, wow, what a brilliant speaker, or something. And, and then maybe you laugh. That's good. I like that stuff. So any of these reactions. But your brain doesn't speak English. It doesn't know English. The same way that the guy in the room doesn't know Chinese. However, the system as a whole, the Chinese room as a whole, does know Chinese. It can speak in Chinese. But the man does not, the same way that the brain does not know English. Our system as a whole knows English. My brain does not. So what are we doing when we're talking about consciousness? We're really talking about what Daniel Dennett called the intentional stance. I can't know that any of you are conscious right now. In fact, I'd rather assume that you're not. It helps me up here. But you can't know that I have any mental life at all. I could just be the guy in the room, in and out, input, output. I could be mimicking it and never have a subjective self, never feel that at all. Rather, what we're doing is we're looking at the physical manifestations of consciousness and inferring that they have some sort of self. There's some sort of self there. They act like me when they're scared. They act like me when they're hungry. I think that they're like me. This sort of functional appearance, sort of intentional stance, is going to help us to decide whether or not a cyborg has a self. So I use in my thesis two different thought experiments, and I juxtapose them together. And they go something like this. Imagine in the future, there's a man lying on a couch, asleep. While he's sleeping, a group of scientists sneak in, scan his brain perfectly. All the neural connections, all the patterns, the entirety of the brain, all the cortical structures, the trillions and trillions of connections. It's impossible to fathom now, but sometime in the future, it will be possible. They come back later, they put it in a machine. The man wakes up and he sees a cyborg in front of him who can function the same way he can, who can act the same way, who can speak of their internal life the same way. However, he does not want to say that it's the same self that he is. He wants to say that this is merely a sort of self, a mimicry. So let's take the same guy. He wakes up and he sees himself and he's scared. He gets up and he runs in the middle of the street and is hit by a car. Now, unfortunately for him, he damages a little piece of his brain. Very, very small part, minutia, very small. He goes to the hospital. But he's lucky. Fortunately for him, a scientist has come up with a way to perfectly recreate the functionality of that piece that he's missing on a machine. So he takes the machine and he puts it in the brain, and the man works perfectly. His brain receives signals the same way, forwards them the same way around, responds the same way to things. He testifies that, yes, I function exactly the same and there's no problem here. But unfortunately for this guy, again, he runs onto the street and is hit by another car. He's very unlucky. But good for him, the scientist comes back and says, I can do that machine, that other part again. I can do that other part of the brain. I can fix that, no problem. Just a smaller part. This guy keeps getting hit by cars over and over again until eventually his full brain is mechanical. At what point in this Wright's paradox, at what point are we going to say that it goes from being a functional mind, a self, to just a sort of fake self? That's not the same. So he realizes that he has become that first cyborg, but we're more likely to give selfhood mindedness, to give the subjective nature to that second cyborg because it maintained it throughout. We prescribed in the beginning. So we have to unpack these presuppositions from our notion of consciousness, of mind. So what I want to say in offloading consciousness is that we are already becoming that second cyborg to some extent. Now, it's not as physical as my example. It's not as outright, but it's slowly over time. We're beginning to offload and unload and outsource a bit of our nature, a bit of ourselves onto technology, taking pieces of our function and sharing them with the technology around us. A great example of this is to think back before you had cell phones. How well did you remember your friends' numbers, your friends' phone numbers back then? Pretty well. You had to know them or you couldn't call your friends. But now we don't need that information. I've offloaded onto my phone, my contact section. It's there with me at all times. Another good example of this is how well people used to know how to travel around, how spatially aware they were. At this point, I have GPS. It's an extension of myself into the world that allows me to experience the world in a whole new way. So we have all these perceptive tools, and there's several systems that allow us to perceive the world, allow us to experience the world. And as technology begins to take more finite, more ingrained places in those perceptive understandings, in those experiences, we'll begin to share ourselves and blur the line between man and machine. So offloading is more than just changing what we experience. Offloading is changing the way we experience the world. How do we experience things? At the hands of technology, we've seen people go from not having any access to any sort of information to having the entirety of information at their fingertips at all times. How will this change who we are and how we experience? I think that as we begin to offload self, as we begin to put ourselves externally into the world, we will have an objective insight into the subjective nature of self, and we'll be able to understand the functionality of how the brain creates the mind. Thank you very much.